I want to talk about unit testing best practices. And so the first thing I wanted to talk about is the fact is, like, this idea of a talk is what is best practices, right? Just first off, the idea of the word best, right? So I'm up here telling you these are absolutely the best possible things you can do with your testing, right? Of course not. That's ridiculous. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some really good ideas that have been discovered so far about testing. And there's possibly better ideas, and you might even find that some things that work for you conflict with some of the things that I say. That's okay, right? These are things that I've found to be useful and other people have found to be useful, but that doesn't mean that they are necessarily the best things you could possibly do. There's still yet lots of more to be discovered. So this is item number one. So this whole talk, right, I'm going to be talking about just like a list of things. If you want, you can write down whatever jumps out at you that might be useful. I do have some code. We might look at some code, but mostly I'm going to be talking about concepts of testing. So item number one, use the AAA structure. We want to start off by arranging all of our necessary preconditions and inputs. Then we want to act on the object or class under test. And finally, we want to assert that the expected results have occurred. We sometimes talk about this as a state change, right? Which is we start in an initial state, we change our state, and then we check that the new state is exactly the state that we wanted it to be. That is the idea of a good test, is that we go through those phases. In structuring your tests, you want your test code to actually show this structure, right? Most tests should show each of these three pieces. Sometimes a test won't have some of the first piece, right? And sometimes the test may not have some of the second piece, but as best as you can, you want to show that your tests are doing exactly all these three things. So let's go look at some code here. Here is an example test right here in this the first one. So I am setting up this mock auth get type and return values is setting up a mock to do something, right? So this isn't actually part of my initial state. My initial state was really just when I create my component right up here. So inside of my test, I don't have much in the way of a range. You could call this an arrange, right? I am setting up and telling it, hey, in this test, when this thing happens, I want you to do this. So I'm kind of getting it ready, but this isn't much of an arrange. So I'd really say if I was looking at this, I would say this is really just an act and then an assert. The arrange doesn't necessarily exist because we're already in the initial state. The initial state is the component has just been constructed but hasn't gone through its change detection phase yet. So that's the initial state. But still, notice how I myself, this is what I like to do, I put in some white space in here. Got a little bit of white space in between my act and my assert, right? So this is a good structure. Going down here, same thing. My initial state was already set because I created the component. So all I've done is I've acted and then I've asserted. So could I move my initial state down into my test? I could. We'll talk about some things about best practices, another best practice in a minute. But that's a couple of tests of examples of how you should start and do this in order, right? There are certain kinds of mocks that can cause you to do things out of order. We call them actually mocks. This is the actual mock type. And I hate them because of the reason that we put things out of order. I don't have any example code for that, but basically what it says is when setting up a mock, you actually do your expectations first. And I hate those because I want my expectations last. I want to read my story as a test, or my test as a story. Next, never use branching logic. This is a simple one. If you have an if in your test, you are probably, almost definitely doing something wrong. It's time to go home and reevaluate your life. No. Don't use ifs in your tests because the point of a test is to test one state transitioning to another state. An if implies that it can be either A or B. And in a test, if you don't know if you're going to be in A or B, then you've got a serious problem, right? Your test says this should happen. If the test says I don't know what's going to happen, that's a problem. This should happen. If it doesn't happen, let me know that it didn't happen. But I don't want any logic in there that says what happens, what do I do if this doesn't happen? That's not what a test is for. So that's our next one, is never use branching logic. Avoid looping. I wanted to say never use looping, but there's times to use looping. The time not to use looping is in the whole test. right? Your whole test should not be a loop. You should not be saying, I'm going to go through here and I'm going to test this condition on 5 different structures. I'm going to do this thing 5 times. That is not what a test is for. There are other structures about tests. There are other things that are in the framework for doing something like that. The good use of a loop is for in your assert statement, if you're testing that something correct happened, you need to say, know that, oh, we did this to all 5 of the objects in this collection, for example, that all 5 of these changed in a certain way, or that I just need to make sure that all 5 of these have a certain property. That's an okay time to use a loop. In that case, it's probably better to create your own matchers. Again, if you haven't done testing, you may not, or a lot, you may not know what a matcher is, but let's go to some code. This is a matcher right here, to be true or to have been called. These matchers basically say, hey, I'm expecting that this thing, I'm expecting something about this thing I'm passing into the expect. So I'm expecting that login type local is true, right? So if you're, say, expecting that all objects are users, right? And how do you know that each object is a user? Well, it has to have a user ID property, it has to have a name, and you want to know. You can create custom matches for that, and you can say all objects are users, and it's very expressive and declarative. So you can hide the loops, but having loops inside of your it is generally a code smell. So don't do that. Prefer isolated tests. If you have not done anything with unit tests in Angular, you may not understand what this means. In Angular, there's 2 types of tests. Okay? We have isolated tests, and I call them unit tests, and people might get in arguments with me about whether they're unit tests or integration tests, because one of them is actually called an integration test. But there are isolated tests and integration tests. Right? When you're writing unit tests, you want to prefer isolated tests for several reasons. They're faster, they're easier to maintain, they're easier to write. They execute a ton faster. We want to prefer them. That doesn't mean that we only do them, but that means we prefer them. So back to code. These right here are integration tests because we're using the test bed. Right? So what this does is this actually creates the whole component as a whole thing, and it puts in its template. So these are slow, and we have to worry about what the template looks like. All right, most of the time when we're testing our code, especially writing unit tests, we care about one little tiny piece about some code that we wrote. So these are integration tests. They are slower, right? But isolated tests only test the actual component. So if we were to write an isolated test, let's look at this code right here. This is my new article component. Notice that it is 198 lines long. We're not going to talk about the wisdom of having 198 lines of code in a single component. We're just going to accept the fact that we have one. And we're going to look at our template really quick. That's got 72 lines of code. Okay? This is a relatively complex component. And what's crazy about this darn thing is if we look through here, and if I look for P dash, oh, sorry, not P, find P dash. Notice all these components, this auto component, this calendar component, this drop-down component, this auto, well, that's a custom autocomplete, a CAPTCHA. These are all third-party components that I have added in this template. So when I go and write a test for this, for my new article, I have this crazy problem that I have got to mock out. I'm going to go down to I have got to mock out all of those subcomponents because I'm trying to test my component and its template, and the template says, hey, you've got all these children, right? You've got an autocomplete child component. You've got a calendar child component. You've got a drop-down child component. You've got a CAPTCHA child component. So I'm down here at line 137 before I even begin the well, here's my before each, is on line 117. So it takes me 115 lines of code just to create all the mocks that I need. And then I can't write my first test until line 161. Let's look at the same thing in an isolated test. Same exact thing. Isolated test starts at line 39. Okay? I don't even have to show you the code for you to understand that 160? 160 lines versus 39 lines of code. Totally, I mean, we're in a different planet. We're in an entirely different ballpark here. Isolated tests are so much simpler and quicker. And in the end, I wrote the exact same test. It should have an authors list test right there versus it should have an authors list. These are the exact same test. They test the exact same thing, right? And this one, it took me 161 lines before I could write that test. And the other one, it took me 39. We want to prefer isolated tests. That doesn't mean that there aren't times we want to use integration tests. We want to test a component with its template, but we're going to prefer isolated tests. Next, we want to reset our state properly. Notice in this, it should have an authors list. I've got a little mock here that says, hey, when the article service, when you call get authors on it, I want you to return an observable over this authors test data, right? Now, I have no idea for sure if I can look at my code and I can see exactly what happens to the authors test data, right? So I need a set of test data to use in my unit test. And I can look at my code and see that, hey, the code doesn't necessarily modify the test data. And so I can be reasonably confident that it doesn't modify that test data. Yet, you'll notice in my before each, I actually initialize the authors data. So on every test, I am resetting that authors data to its initial state. I'm taking this extreme approach of whatever my initial state is, I want to make sure it is always reset to exactly what I know it should be. If I were to take this and move it out to right here, right, I could then put let in front of that and get rid of this. Normally, I know that, oh, it doesn't modify the author's data. It shouldn't modify the author's data. Maybe it should modify a copy of it. It should make a copy. Whatever it should do, I think I know how my code works. The test is there to assert that the code really does work a certain way. And if you have things like, oh, I accidentally have a bug that manipulates and mutates this data, the next test is now dealing with dirty state. That is absolutely a terrible idea in unit testing or in any kind of testing. So we always want to make sure that our initial state. So these are a little bit of edge case. I'm showing you the edge case here. Normally we think, well, as long as I initialize my component inside of my before each so that it is initialized fresh every time, that's enough. But think about things like your test data. Anything that it sits outside of the before each, is there anything there that actually needs to sit inside of your before each so that your initial state is absolutely fresh every time? Next, tell the story. This is my favorite, my absolute favorite tip or best practice. A test should be a story, all right? So somebody throw out one of their favorite childhood stories that most people would know. Goldilocks and the Three Bears, all right. And the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right, if I were to tell a quick version of it, the three bears go out, they come back home, and their house is changed, right? So what I don't do when I'm talking about the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears is talk about how, now I'm not Hans, is that Hans Christian Andersen? I've read some of Hans Christian Andersen. I noticed that, man, that guy he talks about a lot of stuff that I didn't really care about, but I'm talking about the good version of the story, the one that I tell my kids, right? I don't talk about where Goldilocks went to school. Not relevant to the story. I don't talk about how tall Goldilocks is. Not relevant to the story. I don't talk about who Goldilocks' best friend is. Not relevant to this story. There might be other stories about Goldilocks, but those things are all relevant, right? I talk about the fact that the bears were away and Goldilocks came in, right? It's very important in a story that you don't overwhelm people with things that aren't important. Vice versa, what I don't do is start off with the little bear said, my porridge is too hot, right? I mean, I might be butchering this story. But again, the important point is, well, I can't start my story too late. Then you missed out on context, right? We don't start the story of Star Wars in the cantina, right? It starts, those 1, 2, and 3, those don't exist. It starts at the good part, right? Where Darth Vader's, the Star Destroyer is attacking and captures the Tantive 4, right? That's the right place to start that story. We don't start farther in. A test is exactly the same thing. It has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has to have an intro, a climax and a denouement. So notice how here I've got to describe, this is my initial state. So I've got two tests about the initial state, okay? Close that up. That one, in the initial state, it should have an authors list and it should have a tag list, okay? Then I say, oh, I've got this search authors method, okay? And in the search authors method, it should return, just the matching authors, right? So I've got a test for that. Notice the difference. Now, let's look at here in the initial state. I set up what my mock article service is going to do and my get tags is going to do, and then I call detect changes. Right? I called change detection so that it'll set up run the data bindings. Right? Notice in my search authors, where is detect changes in this one test? Where is detect changes? Everybody see it up there in that before each? It's a stupid question to ask because you all have eyes. It's up in before each. Is it in the test? No. In the initial state, where was detect changes? It's in the test, right? There's a difference between where I put detect changes based on what story I'm telling. In the initial state, detect changes is such a critical piece of the story, it has to live in the test. Notice, again, in my initial state, do I have duplication in my tests? Absolutely. When we're writing real code and we see duplication like this, what do? We who knows the next word? Mercilessly what? Mercilessly blank. So we mercilessly refactor that out in production code. But in our tests, we want duplication sometimes because that's important to the story. The story of each of these tests is, hey, I want the authors to return this authors test data. I want the tags to return the tags test data. And then I want to call my change detection. And now I know that my author list should be 4. Tag list, same thing. My tag list should be 4 because they each have 4 items, right? In the story of the test of search authors, when we're talking about, hey, you should return just the matching authors, all I want to do is, hey, go ahead and get a handle to the autocomplete component and trigger the complete method event. Now I can assert my story is different. I don't care that detect changes. It has to be there. It has to exist. Just like the story of Goldilocks doesn't exist if Goldilocks' mom and dad didn't meet and fall in love, assumably, or have an arranged marriage, whichever, right? If they don't meet and have Goldilocks, then the story doesn't exist. But I don't care about that part in the story of Goldilocks. I only care about the fact that Goldilocks shows up at the Three Bears house. It's the same thing. I'm telling a story with my test. Focus on dry, not in our tests in our regular code. Instead, we want our tests to be a little bit of damp. So we repeat ourselves if necessary in order to tell the test, or tell the story, sorry. A test should be a complete story, all within the it. I shouldn't have to, if I've got, ultimately I might have 10 or 15 tests about one method, right? So if I'm down on the 15th test, I shouldn't have to scroll back up to the before each to figure out what's going on, right? It shouldn't be so relative to what I'm doing that I have to constantly refer up to that. If I am, then I need to move that code down into the it, right? Everything should be within the it. I shouldn't need to look around too much to understand the tests. So you move less interesting setup into your before each, keep your critical setup within the it, and focus on that AAA setup. All right. Next one, use integration tests when appropriate. Talked about this. Prefer isolated tests because they're quicker, they're easier to write, but use integration tests when appropriate. So that means if your template has something really critical, then go ahead and test it. But I find that it's so easy to say, oh my gosh, because I can do integration tests where I can test my component and my template together, I can test that, yes, indeed, the title property does show up, right? But is there tons of value? How likely is it that I got the binding wrong? If I look at this, let me look at this code again. In this new article, the HTML, if I look at some of this, like my NG class, I could write tests all along this, but how likely did I get this wrong? Maybe a little bit. But do I want to test literally everything about my template? I really don't. A lot of this configuration is relatively straightforward. It doesn't change a lot. And if it changes, it's probably for good reasons because we're laying things out differently as we need, as we're adjusting our UI. So what I really want to test is something more interesting. Like, for example, if I see an ng-if, that keys me in, maybe I do want to test that. So always be aware of using integration tests when appropriate, but don't overuse them because they are a lot harder to write. They are a lot slower to execute. So if you're doing a lot of integration tests, you probably should be thinking about something else, like maybe another product that starts with C and ends with Ypres. All right, this is my last tip. I've got 1 minute left. Understand what you're fixing in place. This is related to that last one about integration tests. If you write a test that says, hey, 4 divs down inside of this span is a binding that shows up that shows the title of this page, right? If I write a test around that, I have now fixed in place that that structure has to be exact. A test fixes in place a piece of functionality. Normally, we look at tests and we think about them, we think, that's absolutely what we want. We want to fix this in place so that if anybody ever changes this functionality, it breaks. But we don't always want to fix in place our UI, right? So as much as you can, don't fix your UI in place with your tests. Let your UI be fluid. Let it change as necessary. You want things to be visible when they need to be visible. You need to know that, yes, the title is visible, or because of this ng-if that this element is showing up. But we don't want to fix in place that it has to be exactly this structure. You know, the color might not be important. Maybe it is, but oftentimes the color isn't. We don't want to fix those sorts of things in place. So understand what you're fixing in place. So as a summary, use the AAA structure, never use branching logic, avoid looping, prefer isolated tests, reset your state properly, tell the story unit as integration tests when appropriate, and understand what you are fixing in place. That is just a small set of best practices for unit testing, but it is a set that I personally like a lot. Thank you very much.